I found my father on the kitchen floor at 6:47 in the morning, his face gray and his breathing shallow. The coffee pot was still running, dark liquid pooling across the counter and dripping onto the linoleum where he had collapsed. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and professional, asking me questions I could barely process while my father's chest rose and fell in uneven, terrifying gasps. "My father, he's having a heart attack, I think. Please hurry. We live at 4892 Maple Ridge Drive in Westbrook, Colorado." The operator assured me an ambulance was on its way, giving me instructions to keep him comfortable and monitor his breathing. I pressed my hand against his shoulder, feeling the cold sweat soaking through his flannel shirt. Dad's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and scared, before closing again. Every second felt like an hour as I waited, listening for the sound of sirens that would mean help was coming. Then I heard them. Distant at first, then growing louder as they approached our neighborhood. Relief flooded through me. They were almost here. Dad was going to be okay. The paramedics would know what to do, but the sirens stopped. They weren't getting closer anymore. They had stopped somewhere outside the neighborhood, and I could hear them idling in the distance. Confused and panicking, I ran to the front door and threw it open, expecting to see the ambulance turning onto our street. Instead, I saw nothing. Just empty road stretching toward the main entrance of Maple Ridge Estates. I sprinted down our driveway and onto the street, running toward the sound of the sirens. My bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as I ran past the Hendersons' house, past the Martins, past the row of identical Tudor-style homes that made up our development. When I reached the access road that connected our neighborhood to Highway 36, I stopped dead in my tracks. A construction barrier stretched across the entire width of the road. Orange and white sawhorses, caution tape, and a massive pile of dirt and gravel blocked the only entrance to our neighborhood. Behind the barrier, I could see the ambulance, its lights still flashing, and two paramedics standing beside it with their equipment, staring at the obstruction in apparent disbelief. "What the hell is this?" I screamed, running toward them. "My father is dying!" The older paramedic, a stocky man with gray hair and a weathered face, shook his head. "We can't get through. Someone's blocked off the entire road." "Move it!" I grabbed one of the sawhorses and tried to throw it aside, but it was heavier than it looked, and the pile of dirt and gravel behind it was massive. "Help me move this!" The younger paramedic, a woman in her 30s, was already on her radio. "We need fire department assistance at Maple Ridge Estates Access Road. Road is completely blocked. We have a cardiac emergency inside the development." "How far is your house from here?" the older paramedic asked. "Half a mile, maybe more. He can't wait that long." The two paramedics exchanged a look. Then the man started grabbing equipment from the ambulance. "We'll have to go on foot. Sarah, grab the portable defibrillator and oxygen. I'll get the cardiac kit." I led them back at a dead run, my lungs burning as we raced through the neighborhood. The equipment slowed them down, but they kept pace, their training evident in the way they moved despite carrying heavy bags. Every second that passed felt like a nail being driven into my heart. Dad had already been down for more than 10 minutes by the time we burst back through the front door. The older paramedic, whose name tag read Morrison, dropped to his knees beside my father and immediately began checking vital signs. Sarah set up the portable monitor, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she attached electrodes to Dad's chest. "Heart rate's erratic. BP is 80/50 and dropping," Morrison said, his voice tense. "Get the line started. We need aspirin and nitroglycerin now." They worked with incredible speed and skill, but I could see the strain on their faces. They didn't have their full equipment, they didn't have their stretcher. They couldn't provide the level of care they would have been able to give inside the ambulance. Sarah kept glancing at Morrison with worry in her eyes. "We need to transport, but I don't know if he can make the walk," Morrison said quietly. "The fire department should be clearing the road by now," Sarah replied, but she didn't sound confident. Morrison pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. What's the status on that road clearing?" The radio crackled. "Fire department is on scene, but they're saying they need heavy equipment to move the obstruction. Estimated time is 30 to 40 minutes. "We don't have 30 minutes, Morrison shouted into the radio. "Get a helicopter here, now!" My father's breathing had become even more labored, and the monitor was showing readings that even I could tell were bad. The paramedics administered medication, working to stabilize him, but without the full resources of the hospital, there was only so much they could do. 23 minutes later, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning air. The medical helicopter landed in the neighborhood park 3 blocks away, and Morrison and Sarah managed to get my father onto a makeshift stretcher using a board from our garage. We moved him to the park where the flight paramedics took over and airlifted him to Denver General Hospital. I followed in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white. When I finally made it past the access road, I saw that the fire department was still working to clear the massive obstruction. Mountains of dirt, gravel, and construction materials had been deliberately piled across the entire road. This hadn't been some accident. Someone had intentionally blocked the only way in or out of our neighborhood. At the hospital, I spent 6 hours in the waiting room before a surgeon finally came out to talk to me. Dad had survived, but he'd suffered significant damage to his heart muscle. The delay in treatment had made things much worse than they should have been. If the paramedics had been able to get to him immediately, if they'd been able to load him into the ambulance and start advanced treatment right away, if they'd been able to transport him without that catastrophic delay, the prognosis would have been much better. "He'll recover," the surgeon told me, "but he's going to need a pacemaker and his activity will be severely restricted for the rest of his life. The extended period without proper oxygenation caused damage we couldn't fully repair." I sat down in one of the waiting room chairs, feeling numb. My father's life had been permanently altered because someone had blocked our road. But who would do something like that? And why? The answer came the next day when I returned to Maple Ridge Estates. A notice had been posted on every door in the neighborhood, printed on official HOA letterhead. "Dear residents, as part of the ongoing infrastructure improvement project approved at the last board meeting, the access road has been temporarily closed for repaving and drainage work. Alternative routes are available via the service entrance at the rear of the development. The project is expected to be completed within 2 weeks. Thank you for your patience. Sincerely, Patricia Whitmore, HOA President." I read the notice 3 times, my anger building with each word. There had been no warning about this, no advance notice sent to residents, no signs posted indicating when the work would begin, and most importantly, no one had bothered to consider what would happen in case of an emergency. I stormed over to Patricia Whitmore's house, a massive brick colonial at the end of Sycamore Lane that was easily twice the size of any other home in the development. I pounded on her door until she answered, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and pressed blazer making her look like she was about to attend a board meeting rather than answer her door at 8 in the morning. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "how can I help you?" "You blocked the access road during a medical emergency," I shouted. "My father almost died because the ambulance couldn't get through." Patricia's expression hardened. "The notice about the road work was posted on the community website 3 weeks ago. All residents are required to check the website regularly for important updates." "Posted on the website? That's not good enough. What about people who don't check the website every day? What about emergencies?" "The service entrance at the rear of the development remains accessible," she said primly. "If you had consulted the website, you would have known to direct emergency services to that entrance." "The service entrance that adds 15 minutes to the drive time? The one that's barely wide enough for a car, let alone an ambulance?" Patricia crossed her arms. "The board approved this project unanimously. The infrastructure improvements are necessary and were paid for by a special assessment. The work must proceed on schedule." "You could have waited. You could have given people more warning. My father is in the hospital because of your negligence." "I'm sorry about your father, but this is not the HOA's responsibility. Residents are required to stay informed about community developments. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." She closed the door in my face. I stood there, shaking with rage, before turning and walking back to my house. Dad was going to be in the hospital for at least another week, and then he'd need help during his recovery. I was going to have to take time off work, figure out how to manage his care, and somehow deal with the financial burden of his extended medical treatment. But first, I needed to understand exactly what had happened and whether the HOA could be held responsible. I spent the next 3 days researching HOA regulations, Colorado state law, and liability issues. I learned that HOAs in Colorado have significant power, but that power comes with responsibilities. They're required to maintain common areas and ensure reasonable access to properties. They're also required to provide adequate notice of any actions that might affect residents' use and enjoyment of their properties. I also requested a copy of the minutes from the board meeting where this roadwork had supposedly been approved. When I finally got them, buried in my email inbox, I discovered something interesting. The vote had been 3-2, not unanimous as Patricia had claimed. Two board members, George Chen and Margaret Sullivan, had voted against the project specifically because they were concerned about emergency access during construction. Margaret Sullivan lived 2 streets over from me. I knocked on her door the following afternoon, and she invited me in, offering coffee and cookies while we talked in her kitchen. "I'm so sorry about your father," she said, genuine concern in her eyes. "How is he doing?" "He'll live, but his heart is permanently damaged. The delay in treatment made everything worse." Margaret shook her head, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. "George and I tried to stop this. We argued that blocking the main access road was dangerous and that we should wait until we could coordinate with the construction company to keep at least one lane open at all times. Patricia wouldn't hear it." "Why not?" "Because the contractor she hired offered a discount if they could complete the work in 2 weeks instead of 6. A discount that would make her look good to the other residents because it would reduce the special assessment. Patricia cares more about her image as an efficient HOA president than she does about the safety of the people who live here." "Is there anything I can do? Can I challenge this legally?" Margaret hesitated, then leaned forward. "You might want to talk to a lawyer. What Patricia did might constitute negligence. HOAs are required to maintain reasonable access to properties, especially for emergency services. Completely blocking the only main road without providing adequate alternative access or warning could be seen as a breach of that duty." I left Margaret's house with a sense of purpose. I spent the next few hours calling attorneys, finally finding one who specialized in HOA disputes. His name was Robert Chen, and he agreed to meet with me the following morning. Robert's office was in downtown Denver, a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He was in his 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me everything," he said, pulling out a legal pad. I walked him through the entire incident, from finding my father on the floor to the blocked road to the delayed medical care. I showed him the HOA notice, the board meeting minutes, and the medical records documenting the extent of my father's injuries and the doctor's notes about how the delayed treatment had worsened his condition. Robert listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and tapped his pen against the legal pad. "This is a strong case," he said. "The HOA had a duty to maintain reasonable access to the properties, and they failed in that duty. The fact that they provided essentially no advance warning beyond a website posting is problematic. Most courts would consider that insufficient notice for something as significant as completely blocking the main access road." "What about the service entrance they mentioned? Was it actually viable for emergency vehicle access?" "Not really. It's narrow, poorly maintained, and adds significant time to any response. Plus, no one told emergency services about it." Robert nodded. "That strengthens the case. They can't claim they provided alternative access if that access wasn't practical or communicated to emergency services. Let me ask you something important. Do you have documentation of everything? The 911 call, the paramedic response times, the medical records?" "I can get all of that." "Good. I'll also need a statement from the paramedics who responded. Their testimony about the delay and its impact will be crucial." "They were both amazing. They ran half a mile carrying equipment just to get to my father." "That's the kind of thing a jury would find compelling. Here's what I propose. We file a lawsuit against the HOA for negligence and seek damages for your father's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and the permanent damage to his health. We can also seek punitive damages if we can prove the HOA acted with reckless disregard for resident safety." "How long will this take?" "Cases like this usually take 12 to 18 months to resolve, sometimes longer if they go to trial. But I'll be honest with you, Nathan, most of these cases settle. HOAs have insurance for exactly this kind of liability. and insurance companies don't like going to trial when the facts are this bad for their client. I hired Robert that day. Over the next few weeks, he filed the lawsuit and began the discovery process. The HOA's insurance company assigned them a lawyer, a stern woman named Victoria Ross, who immediately tried to get the case dismissed. She argued that the HOA had provided adequate notice via the website and that residents were responsible for staying informed. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Judge Martha Reynolds, denied the motion to dismiss. The plaintiff has raised sufficient questions about the adequacy of notice and the availability of alternative access. This case will proceed. Discovery was a long and frustrating process. Robert requested documents from the HOA, including all communications about the roadwork, the contract with the construction company, and any discussions about emergency access. Patricia Whitmore fought every request, claiming various privileges and protections. Robert had to file multiple motions to compel her to turn over basic documents, but slowly we started to build a picture of what had really happened. The construction company had indeed offered a discount for a rushed timeline, but their proposal had included a note recommending that the HOA coordinate with local emergency services and provide advance notice to residents via multiple channels, not just the website. Patricia had ignored those recommendations. More damning, we discovered emails between Patricia and the other board members who had voted with her. In one email, Margaret Sullivan had written to Patricia expressing concern about emergency access and asking for a delay until they could develop a proper communication plan. Patricia's response was brief and dismissive. The website notice is sufficient. We need to move forward with the approved timeline. But the real breakthrough came when Robert deposed the paramedics who had responded to the 911 call. I sat in on Morrison's deposition, listening as he recounted the events of that morning with professional precision. When we arrived at the access road, we found it completely impassable, Morrison testified. There was a significant amount of construction material blocking the entire width of the road. It was clear that it would take heavy equipment to clear it. "What did you do then?" Robert asked. "We made the decision to proceed on foot. We grabbed what equipment we could carry and ran approximately half a mile to reach the patient. When we arrived, he was in critical condition." "In your professional opinion, did the delay in reaching the patient affect his medical outcome?" Morrison nodded gravely. "Absolutely. Every minute matters in a cardiac emergency. The delay in reaching him, combined with our inability to transport him in the ambulance with our full equipment, significantly compromised our ability to provide optimal care. We had to call for helicopter transport, which added additional time. In my professional judgment, if we had been able to access the property normally, load the patient into the ambulance, and transport him to the hospital via ground transport, his outcome would have been substantially better." "Can you quantify that?" "The patient experienced significant damage to his heart muscle, based on the timeline and the medical records I reviewed. I believe that damage could have been minimized or possibly prevented with timely intervention. The extended period before we could provide advanced cardiac life support and transport likely contributed to the severity of his condition." Robert thanked Morrison and dismissed him, but he wasn't done. He also scheduled a deposition with Sarah, the other paramedic, and her testimony was even more powerful. "I've been a paramedic for 12 years, Sarah said, her voice steady but emotional. "I've responded to hundreds of cardiac emergencies. I've never encountered a situation where a residential access road was completely blocked without any warning or signage directing us to an alternative route. It was unconscionable." "Why do you characterize it that way?" Robert asked. "Because someone made a decision to block that road without considering the consequences. They didn't notify emergency services. They didn't post signs directing us to another entrance. They didn't ensure that there was a clear path for emergency vehicles. That's not just negligence, it's reckless. Someone could have died. In this case, the patient survived but suffered permanent damage." "Yes, and that damage was preventable. If we had been able to respond normally, that man would likely have made a full recovery. Instead, he'll live with the consequences of that blocked road for the rest of his life." Robert entered both depositions into evidence, and I could see that they were making an impact. Victoria Ross tried to discredit the paramedics, suggesting that they were exaggerating the impact of the delay, but Morrison and Sarah were credible witnesses with years of experience and no reason to lie. The case continued to build. Robert also obtained testimony from the surgeon who had performed my father's cardiac surgery. Dr. Elizabeth Park reviewed the medical records and the timeline of events, and her written opinion was devastating for the HOA's defense. The patient's injuries were directly exacerbated by the delay in medical care, Dr. Park wrote. The extended period between the initial cardiac event and the beginning of advanced medical intervention resulted in increased damage to the heart muscle. This damage is permanent and will significantly affect the patient's quality of life and life expectancy. With timely intervention, as would normally be expected in a residential area with accessible roads, the patient's prognosis would have been substantially better. Armed with this evidence, Robert filed a motion for summary judgment on the issue of liability. He argued that the facts were undisputed. The HOA had blocked the road without adequate notice or consideration for emergency access. The delay had directly harmed my father, and the HOA should be held liable as a matter of law. Judge Reynolds scheduled a hearing on the motion. I sat in the courtroom, my father beside me in a wheelchair. He had been released from the hospital but was still weak and required assistance for most daily activities. His presence was a powerful reminder of what this case was really about. Victoria Ross argued that the HOA had acted reasonably and that my father's injuries were an unfortunate accident, not the result of negligence. Your Honor, the HOA followed proper procedures in approving and executing this infrastructure project. They posted notice on the community website as required by the HOA's governing documents. They provided an alternative entrance. They hired a licensed contractor. These are the actions of a responsible organization, not a negligent one. Robert stood to respond, and I could see the fire in his eyes. Your Honor, let's be clear about what happened here. The HOA completely blocked the only main access road to a residential community of over 200 homes without providing adequate notice to residents or coordinating with emergency services. When my client's father suffered a cardiac emergency, paramedics were forced to abandon their ambulance and run half a mile carrying equipment. The patient suffered permanent, life-altering injuries as a direct result of this delay. The defendant's own board members expressed concern about emergency access, and those concerns were ignored. This is not a close case. This is clear, actionable negligence. Judge Reynolds listened carefully, reviewed the evidence, and then delivered her ruling. I am granting the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment on the issue of liability. The evidence clearly establishes that the defendant failed to exercise reasonable care in blocking the access road without adequate notice or provision for emergency services. The causal connection between that failure and the plaintiff's injuries is well established by expert testimony. The only remaining issue is damages, which will be determined at trial unless the parties can reach a settlement. I felt relief wash over me. We had won on liability. Now, it was just a matter of determining how much the HOA would have to pay. Victoria Ross requested a meeting with Robert to discuss settlement the very next day. We met in Robert's conference room, with me and my father on one side of the table and Victoria on the other. The HOA's insurance carrier is prepared to offer $250,000 to settle this case, Victoria said. Robert didn't hesitate. That's not even close to adequate. We have medical expenses exceeding $180,000. We have ongoing care costs. We have permanent disability. We have pain and suffering. And we have punitive damages exposure given the reckless nature of your client's conduct. I won't even bring an offer below $1 million to my client. Victoria's face tightened. $1 million is excessive. Your client's father is 72 years old. His life expectancy was already limited. I felt my father's hand grip my arm, and I had to restrain myself from saying something I would regret. Robert, however, remained calm and professional. His life expectancy was normal for a healthy man of his age. Now it's significantly reduced because of your client's negligence. And I should mention that we're prepared to present evidence of the HOA president's dismissive attitude toward safety concerns. Those emails between Patricia Whitmore and other board members are going to play very well to a jury. The negotiation continued for another hour, with Victoria gradually increasing her offer and Robert holding firm. Finally, they reached a number that Robert felt was reasonable. $875,000, plus a written agreement that the HOA would implement new policies regarding emergency access and resident notification. "I'll present this to my client," Robert said, "but I need to know this is your final offer." "It is," Victoria said, "and frankly, it's more than generous given the circumstances." Robert turned to me and my father. "Can we step outside for a moment?" We went into his office, and Robert closed the door. "This is a good offer. We could go to trial and possibly get more, but there's always risk. A jury might award less, or the appellate process could tie things up for years. My recommendation is that you accept this settlement." I looked at my father. His face was tired and drawn, but his eyes were clear. "What do you think, Dad?" "I think I'm tired," he said quietly. "I don't want to spend the next year of my life fighting. Take the money. Make sure they change their policies so this doesn't happen to someone else. That's enough for me." We returned to the conference room and accepted the settlement. Victoria prepared the paperwork, and we all signed that afternoon. The HOA's insurance company would pay $875,000 to my father, and the HOA would implement a comprehensive emergency access plan that included multiple forms of resident notification, coordination with local emergency services, and a requirement that at least one access road remain open at all times during any construction project. But I wasn't satisfied yet. The settlement took care of my father's financial needs, but it didn't address the broader question of accountability. Patricia Whitmore was still the HOA president, still making decisions that affected everyone in the neighborhood. I decided to run for the HOA board in the next election. I campaigned door to door, talking to neighbors about what had happened and about the need for better governance. Many people were shocked to learn about the blocked road and the impact it had on my father. Others shared their own stories of Patricia's high-handed behavior and disregard for residents' concerns. The election was held in November, 6 months after the settlement. I ran for one of the 3 open board positions, and I wasn't alone. George Chen and Margaret Sullivan both ran for re-election, and 2 other residents who were fed up with Patricia's leadership also threw their hats in the ring. The results were decisive. All 3 of the candidates who opposed Patricia's leadership won their seats. George Chen received the most votes and was elected board president. One of his first acts was to call for a vote of no confidence in Patricia Whitmore's leadership. The vote was unanimous, and Patricia resigned from the board in a fury, claiming that she was being unfairly scapegoated. But the story didn't end there. About 2 weeks after Patricia's resignation, I received a phone call from a detective with the Westbrook Police Department. His name was Detective Mark Rodriguez, and he wanted to meet with me to discuss the incident with the blocked road. "Why are you investigating this now?" I asked when we met at the police station. "The civil case is already settled." "Because we received information suggesting that the road blocking might have been more than just negligence," Detective Rodriguez said. "We've been looking into the HOA's finances, and we've discovered some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The construction company that did the road work billed the HOA $85,000 for the project. But we've obtained records showing that the actual cost should have been around $45,000. We believe someone pocketed the difference." I felt my stomach drop. Patricia Whitmore. We're still gathering evidence, but yes, she's a person of interest. We're also looking into several other projects that were approved during her tenure as HOA president. There appears to be a pattern of inflated billing, with the excess money being diverted. The investigation took another 3 months. During that time, Detective Rodriguez and his team subpoenaed bank records, interviewed contractors, and traced the flow of money through various accounts. What they discovered was stunning. Patricia Whitmore had been embezzling from the HOA for nearly 2 years. She had set up a shell company that submitted inflated bids for various projects, with the excess money being funneled into her personal accounts. The road project that had caused my father's injuries was just one of many fraudulent schemes. In total, she had stolen more than $300,000 from the HOA's accounts. Patricia was arrested on charges of theft, embezzlement, and fraud. The arrest was made at her home early one morning, and I happened to be driving past as the police let her out in handcuffs. She saw me and her face twisted with rage. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You couldn't leave well enough alone." I didn't respond. I just watched as they put her in the police car and drove away. The criminal trial took place 8 months later. I attended every day of testimony, watching as prosecutors laid out the evidence of Patricia's systematic theft. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she had simply been managing the HOA's finances and that any discrepancies were honest mistakes, but the paper trail was too clear. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Thomas Harrison sentenced Patricia Whitmore to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to the HOA. "Ms. Whitmore, you were in a position of trust," the judge said. "The residents of Maple Ridge Estates relied on you to manage their community responsibly and honestly. Instead, you stole from them. You enriched yourself at their expense, and when your negligence resulted in serious harm to one of those residents, you showed no remorse. This court cannot countenance such behavior." Patricia was led away, and I finally felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, not just for my father, but for everyone in the community who had been victimized by her greed and negligence. My father made a slow but steady recovery. He would never be the same as he was before that morning when I found him on the kitchen floor, but he adapted to his new limitations. He walked every day, following his doctor's orders. He took his medications religiously. He attended cardiac rehabilitation, and slowly, he rebuilt his strength. We moved out of Maple Ridge Estates about a year after the settlement. Too many bad memories lingered in that house, in that neighborhood. We bought a small ranch-style home in a quiet part of Boulder, close to the hospital and with easy access to emergency services. No HOA, no complicated rules. Just a simple house where we could live in peace. I still serve on the Maple Ridge Estates HOA board as an outside consultant, helping them implement the reforms that were part of the settlement agreement. The new emergency access plan has become a model for other HOAs in Colorado. Multiple access roads are clearly marked. Emergency services are notified in advance of any construction projects. Residents receive notice via multiple channels, including email, text message, and physical letters. And most importantly, the board takes safety seriously. The settlement money allowed my father to retire comfortably. He spends his days reading, gardening, and spending time with his grandchildren. He doesn't talk much about what happened, but sometimes I catch him staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. And I know he's thinking about that morning on the kitchen floor, about how close he came to dying, because someone decided that saving a few dollars and finishing a project quickly was more important than people's lives. I think about it too. I think about the paramedics running half a mile with heavy equipment, fighting against time to save my father's life. I think about Morrison's face when he realized how serious the situation was and how limited his resources were. I think about Sarah's testimony during her deposition, the anger and frustration in her voice when she described the blocked road as unconscionable. They were right. It was unconscionable. And while the lawsuit provided financial compensation and the criminal case provided punishment, the real victory was in the changes that were made to prevent it from happening again. The new policies, the new leadership, the new commitment to putting residents' safety first, those are the things that matter most. One afternoon, about 2 years after everything happened, I was visiting my father at his house when we heard sirens in the distance. We both tensed instinctively, that old panic rising in our chests. But the sirens passed by, heading toward whatever emergency required their attention, and we gradually relaxed. "You know what I think about sometimes?" my father said, breaking the silence. What's that?" "I think about how lucky we were. Lucky that you were there that morning. Lucky that the paramedics were willing to run half a mile. Lucky that the helicopter was available. Lucky that Dr. Park was on duty. So many things could have gone wrong. But they didn't." "No, they didn't. But someone else might not be so lucky. That's why what you did, fighting the HOA, making sure they changed their policies, that matters. Maybe you saved someone else's life." I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. The changes we had forced the HOA to implement weren't just about accountability or justice. They were about making sure that the next person who had a medical emergency in Maple Ridge Estates wouldn't have to worry about whether an ambulance could reach them. They were about making sure that paramedics could do their jobs without encountering unconscionable obstacles. A few months later, I received an email from George Chen, the new HOA president. He had been contacted by Morrison, the paramedic who had responded to my father's emergency. Morrison wanted to come speak at an HOA meeting about emergency preparedness and the importance of maintaining clear access for first responders. I attended that meeting, sitting in the community center alongside about 50 other residents. Morrison stood at the front of the room, his presentation displayed on a screen behind him. He talked about response times, about the critical importance of every minute in an emergency, about the challenges paramedics face, even under normal circumstances. Then, he told them about that morning at Maple Ridge Estates. He described arriving at the blocked road, making the decision to proceed on foot, running through the neighborhood with Sarah, arriving to find my father in critical condition. His voice was steady and professional, but I could hear the emotion underneath. "I've been a paramedic for 27 years, Morrison said. "I've saved lives and I've lost patients. It's the nature of the job. But I've never felt more helpless than I did that morning, knowing that we had the equipment and the training to help but couldn't access our patient because someone had decided that construction was more important than safety. The changes this HOA has implemented since then are exactly what every community should be doing. You've made it possible for us to do our jobs. You've made it possible for us to save lives, and I want to thank you for that." The room erupted in applause. After the meeting, I approached Morrison to thank him for coming. "How's your father doing?" he asked. "Better. He'll never be the same, but he's alive and he's managing." Morrison nodded. "I'm glad. I think about that call sometimes. I think about how close it was. Another few minutes and we might have lost him. We're grateful for everything you did. Running half a mile with all that equipment, you and Sarah both. It was above and beyond." "It's the job," Morrison said simply. "But I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate what you did holding the HOA accountable. It matters." As I drove home that night, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 years. The terror of finding my father on the floor, the frustration of the blocked road, the long legal battle, the criminal investigation, the trial, the changes. It had been exhausting and painful, and at times overwhelming, but it had also been necessary. Patricia Whitmore's negligence and greed had nearly cost my father his life, and her crimes had harmed an entire community. She needed to be held accountable, and the system needed to be changed to prevent it from happening again. And that's exactly what happened. The settlement compensated my father for his injuries and suffering. The criminal conviction punished Patricia for her crimes. The policy changes protected future residents from similar negligence. Justice, in all its forms, had been served. My father celebrated his 75th birthday 3 years after his heart attack. We had a small party at his house, just family and a few close friends. He was still limited in what he could do, still dependent on his pacemaker and his medications, but he was alive and smiling and surrounded by people who loved him. As I watched him blow out the candles on his birthday cake, I thought about all the birthdays he might not have had if things had gone differently. If the paramedics had given up instead of running half a mile, if the helicopter hadn't been available, if Dr. Park hadn't been able to save him, if we hadn't fought back against the HOA and forced them to change, but things didn't go differently. We fought, and we won, and my father got to have this birthday and hopefully many more to come. And somewhere in Maple Ridge Estates, the access roads were clear and the emergency plans were in place, and another family wouldn't have to go through what we went through. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because in the end, that's what justice really means, not just punishment for wrongs, not just compensation for injuries, but change that prevents those wrongs and injuries from happening again. We had achieved that. The road was clear. The system was fixed. And my father was alive to see it. The last time I drove through Maple Ridge Estates, about 6 months after my father's birthday party, I made a point of driving past the access road where everything had started. There was a new sign there now, clearly visible from the highway. Emergency access road must remain clear at all times. Beyond it, the road was wide and well maintained, with clear markings and proper drainage. I stopped my car and got out, standing at the spot where I had first seen that terrible barrier blocking the road. It seemed impossible now, looking at the clean open road that someone had once piled dirt and equipment across the entire width, creating an impassable obstacle. But it had happened. I had the memories and the scars to prove it. A car pulled up behind me, and Margaret Sullivan got out. She had remained on the HOA board and had become one of the strongest advocates for the new safety policies. "Nathan," she said warmly, "what brings you by?" "Just checking on things, making sure the changes are holding," she smiled. "They are. We take emergency access very seriously now. George makes sure of it." "Good. That's good." We stood there together, looking at the clear road, both of us thinking about what had been and what might have been. "Your father saved lives, you know," Margaret said quietly. "By going through what he did, and by you fighting back the way you did. You probably saved other people from experiencing the same thing." "I hope so. That's what makes it worth it." "It is, and the community is better for it. We all learned an important lesson about the responsibilities that come with governing a community. It's not just about rules and assessments and keeping the grass trimmed. It's about people's lives and safety." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then I shook her hand and got back in my car. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Margaret still standing there, watching the road, a guardian making sure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. My father and I never talked much about Patricia Whitmore after her sentencing. She became something we had moved past, a chapter that was closed. But we did talk about the other people involved in the story: Morrison and Sarah, the paramedics who had refused to give up, Dr. Park, who had saved his life in the operating room, Robert Chen, who had fought for justice, Judge Reynolds, who had seen through the HOA's defenses, Detective Rodriguez, who had uncovered Patricia's crimes. "It takes a lot of people to make things right," my father said once. "One person can do wrong very easily. But making things right, that takes a whole community of people who care." He was right. Justice hadn't been the work of one person or one lawsuit or one criminal trial. It had been the work of paramedics who ran half a mile, doctors who fought to save a life, lawyers who refused to back down, judges who saw through deception, detectives who followed the evidence, and community members who demanded better governance. And in the end, that's what saved my father's life and changed a community for the better. Not one heroic individual, but a whole network of people who cared enough to do their jobs right and fight for what was correct. 5 years after that morning, when I found my father on the kitchen floor, Maple Ridge Estates won an award from the Colorado HOA Association for its emergency preparedness program. George Chen invited me and my father to attend the ceremony. We sat in the audience as George accepted the award and gave a speech about the importance of putting resident safety first. "This award means a lot to our community," George said, "but it means even more because of how we got here. We learned these lessons the hard way, through a tragedy that should never have happened. One of our residents nearly died because we failed in our duty to maintain emergency access. His son had to fight us in court to get justice. And in the process, we learned that being an HOA isn't about power or control or enforcing rules. It's about serving the people who live in our community and making sure they're safe and cared for. This award represents that lesson, and we accept it with humility and a commitment to never forget where we came from." The audience applauded, and I saw several people wiping away tears. My father squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back. We had come so far from that terrible morning, from the blocked road and the desperate run and the permanent injuries. We had come through fire and come out stronger on the other side. After the ceremony, Morrison found us in the crowd. He was retired now, but he had come to the ceremony to support the HOA's new program. "I'm proud of what you all accomplished," he told us. "This is how it should be everywhere." "Thank you for everything you did," my father said. "I wouldn't be here without you." Morrison shook his head. "I just did my job, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you got to see this. It makes all the hard parts of the job worth it." We talked for a while longer, sharing stories and catching up. Then Morrison had to leave, heading back to his retirement in the mountains. But before he left, he turned back to us one more time. "Keep fighting the good fight," he said. "The world needs more people like you who aren't willing to accept injustice." As I watched him walk away, I realized that was exactly what we had done. We had refused to accept injustice. We had refused to let the HOA's negligence and Patricia Whitmore's crimes go unpunished. We had fought back, through the legal system and through community organizing and through sheer determination. And we had won. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who would come after us. The roads were clear. The systems were in place. The community was safer. That was victory. That was justice. That was enough. My father lived for 8 more years after his heart attack, far longer than the doctors had initially predicted. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 80, surrounded by family. At his funeral, people told stories about his kindness, his strength, his resilience in the face of adversity. But the story that meant the most to me was the one George Chen told. "This man changed our community," George said. "Through what he survived and what his son fought for, he made Maple Ridge Estates a better, safer place for everyone. He taught us that leadership means putting people first, always. That's a legacy that will last long after all of us are gone." And it was true. The emergency preparedness program my father's experience had inspired was still in place, still protecting residents. The policies we had fought for were still being followed. The lessons we had learned were still being taught. His suffering had meaning. His survival had purpose. His legacy was safety. As I stood at his grave after the funeral, I made him a promise. I would continue the work we had started. I would keep advocating for better HOA governance. I would keep telling the story of what happened and why it mattered. I would make sure that his experience continued to protect people for years to come. And I have kept that promise. I consult with HOAs across Colorado now, helping them develop emergency preparedness plans and safety protocols. I give talks at community meetings and conferences. I work with legislators on bills to improve HOA accountability and oversight. The work never ends, but it matters. Because somewhere right now, someone is having a medical emergency. And somewhere right now, paramedics are responding. And because of what my father went through, because of the fight we fought, there's one less barrier between that person and the help they need. The road is clear. The access is open. The system works. That's what justice looks like. Not perfect, not complete, but better than it was. Better because we refused to accept injustice. Better because we fought back. Better because we turned tragedy into change. And that, in the end, is the story I wanted to tell. Not just about a blocked road and a heart attack and a lawsuit, although those things happened, but about how ordinary people can fight back against negligence and corruption, about how one person's suffering can become a catalyst for change, about how justice, real justice, is not just about punishment or compensation, but about making the world a little bit safer for everyone. My father understood that. He lived it. And now, years after his death, his legacy continues in every clear access road, every emergency preparedness plan, every HOA that puts safety first. He saved lives he never met, prevented tragedies he never witnessed, protected people he never knew. That's the power of refusing to accept injustice. That's the power of fighting back. That's the power of one person's story to change the world. The road is clear now. Thanks to my father, thanks to everyone who fought alongside us, the road is clear.